The rhythmic thrum of the military transport plane's engines filled Kofi's ears as he gazed out the small window. The landscape below had changed from the lush green of his home region to an expanse of arid, sun-baked earth. After months of additional specialized training following basic, Kofi and his unit were being deployed to their first posting, a remote outpost in the country's northern border region. As the plane began its descent, Kofi's mind wandered to the farewell he'd shared with his family just days ago. His mother's tears, his father's strong embrace, and his siblings' mix of awe and sadness were etched in his memory. He clutched the small fabric amulet his grandmother had pressed into his hand, a talisman for protection on his journey. The jarring touchdown on the rough airstrip snapped Kofi back to the present. As they disembarked, the heat hit him like a physical force. The air was thick with dust, and the sun beat down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. This harsh environment would be home for the next 6 months. Captain Wosu, their commanding officer, gathered the unit. "Welcome to Forward Operating Base Sigma," he announced, his voice carrying over the whine of the plane's dying engines. "This is the front line of our nation's security. Your training ends today, real service begins now." The base was a far cry from the polished facilities of their training camp. A collection of prefabricated buildings and tents surrounded by high walls and razor wire, it looked like an island of human presence in the vast, empty landscape. Kofi and his fellow soldiers were quickly assigned to their quarters, Spartan rooms with bunk beds and little else. Life at FOB Sigma quickly fell into a routine, but one fraught with an underlying tension that Kofi had never experienced before. Each day began before dawn with a patrol of the surrounding area. Kofi learned to scan the horizon constantly, watching for any sign of movement or disturbance that could indicate a threat. The region was known for smuggling activities and occasional incursions by armed groups from neighboring countries. The heat was a constant enemy. By midday, temperatures soared to unbearable levels. Kofi's uniform was perpetually soaked with sweat, and the taste of dust seemed to linger constantly in his mouth. Water became precious, rationed carefully to ensure they never ran out in this unforgiving environment. Nights brought a different kind of challenge. As Kofi stood guard on the base's walls, the darkness seemed alive with potential threats. Every shadow, every rustle in the sparse vegetation could be an approaching enemy. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. The lives of his comrades and the security of his nation depended on his vigilance. Weeks passed, and the monotony began to wear on the unit. Some soldiers grumbled about the harsh conditions and the lack of action. But Sergeant Major Okonkwo's words echoed in Kofi's mind: "Boredom is a luxury in war. Be grateful for quiet days." That lesson hit home hard one sweltering afternoon, 2 months into their deployment. Kofi was part of a squad sent to investigate reports of suspicious activity near a small village 20 kilometers from the base. As they approached in their armored vehicle, the crack of gunfire shattered the quiet. "Ambush!" yelled Sergeant Abesai, their squad leader. "Take cover." Kofi's training kicked in instantly. He leaped from the vehicle, hitting the ground and crawling to the nearest cover, a low stone wall. His heart pounded in his ears as bullets whizzed overhead. This was no drill, this was real combat. Through the chaos, Kofi heard Sergeant Abesai calling out orders. They needed to flank the attackers. Kofi locked eyes with Zaki, his old training buddy, now a fellow rifleman in his squad. With a nod, they began to move, providing covering fire for each other as they advanced. The firefight seemed to last an eternity, though later Kofi would learn it was over in less than 15 minutes. When it was done, 3 of the attackers lay dead, 2 were captured, and the rest had fled. Miraculously, none of Kofi's squad had been killed, though 2 suffered injuries. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what had just occurred hit Kofi like a physical blow. He had taken a life. The weight of that act settled on his shoulders, a burden he knew he would carry forever. That night, back at the base, Kofi sat alone, struggling to reconcile the pride of having protected his comrades with the heavy knowledge of what it had cost. Zaki found him there, offering a canteen of water and a silent companionship that spoke volumes. They sat together under the star-filled sky, 2 young men grappling with the harsh realities of their chosen path. The ambush changed things at FOB Sigma. The abstract threat became very real, and every patrol thereafter carried a new weight of caution and readiness. Kofi found himself growing hyper-aware of his surroundings, jumping at small noises even when off-duty. But amid the stress and danger, Kofi also discovered profound moments of connection with his fellow soldiers. They shared stories of home, dreams for the future, and fears they couldn't express to anyone else. In quiet moments, Amara taught some of them to play a strategy game from her home village, using pebbles and lines drawn in the dust. Zaki, who had a talent for impressions, would often lift spirits with his comedic portrayals of their commanders. 3 months into the deployment, their unit was tasked with a humanitarian mission. A prolonged drought had hit a cluster of villages in their area of responsibility hard. Kofi and his comrades escorted water tankers and food supplies, providing security as aid workers distributed the desperately needed resources. As Kofi helped unload supplies, a small boy approached him, eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. Kofi knelt down, smiling, and offered the child a small packet of biscuits from his rations. The boy's face lit up with joy, and in that moment, Kofi felt a renewed sense of purpose. This, too, was part of being a soldier, not just fighting, but protecting and serving those in need. The latter half of their deployment brought new challenges. Tensions with a neighboring country led to increased patrols along the border. Intelligence reports warned of possible larger-scale incursions. The atmosphere at FOB Sigma grew tense, every soldier acutely aware that they might be called upon to defend their nation's sovereignty at any moment. Kofi's leadership abilities, recognized since basic training, came to the forefront during this time. Captain Wosu began assigning him more responsibilities, often putting him in charge of small teams during patrols and operations. The trust of his superiors and the respect of his peers both heartened Kofi and weighted him with a new level of responsibility. As their 6-month deployment neared its end, Kofi reflected on how much he had changed. The idealistic young man who had left his village was gone, replaced by a battle-tested soldier who had faced death and grappled with the moral complexities of his duty. He had seen the worst of humanity in the eyes of enemies intent on harm, and the best in the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers and the gratitude of civilians they'd helped. On their final night at FOB Sigma, as Kofi packed his few belongings, he found the amulet his grandmother had given him. It was worn now, stained with sweat and dust, but intact, much like Kofi himself. He carefully tucked it into his pocket, a bridge between the boy he had been and the man he had become. The next morning, As they boarded the transport plane for the journey home, Kofi took one last look at the base that had been his home for half a year. The harsh landscape, once alien and foreboding, now felt familiar. He had left his mark here, not just in the missions accomplished and battles fought, but in the growth and changes within himself. As the plane lifted off, carrying them back to the green lands of home, Kofi felt a mix of emotions: relief at leaving the dangers behind, pride in what they had accomplished, and apprehension about returning to civilian life, even if just for a short leave. He knew he was returning a different person than when he had left. Kofi Ademola, the farm boy turned soldier, had faced his first true test in the unforgiving crucible of a frontline deployment. He had survived, learned, and grown. As the arid landscape fell away beneath the plane, Kofi knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. His journey as a soldier was far from over, but he had taken a monumental step forward, forever changed by the experiences of his first deployment.